The notice was printed on cream-colored paper with a burgundy letterhead. Official, weighted, the kind of document designed to make you feel small before you'd read a single word. Marcus Chen found it tucked beneath his windshield wiper on a Tuesday morning in late April, which struck him as odd, because his truck was parked in his own driveway, on his own property, behind a gate he'd installed himself. He stood there in his work boots and his faded University of Washington sweatshirt, coffee going cold in his left hand, and read the thing twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original crease, slid it into his breast pocket, and walked down to the dock. He stood at the end of it for a long time. And the lake was doing what it always did in April, holding the sky and its surface like a mirror that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to reflect. The mountains were out, which didn't happen every day, and the water was that particular shade of blue-gray that exists only in the Pacific Northwest, only in spring, only in the hour before the clouds come back to reclaim what the sun briefly borrowed. A pair of mergansers worked the shallows near the cattails. A heron stood motionless on the far bank, like a piece of driftwood that had learned patience. Marcus had bought this property for this view, for this dock, for this exact morning. He'd spent 28 years as a civil engineer, most of them with the Army Corps of Engineers, on calculating load tolerances and drainage coefficients and the precise mathematical relationship between water and the structures human beings build to live beside it. He understood water the way a musician understands silence, not as an absence, but as a presence with its own logic, its own demands, its own long memory. When he retired at 50, he'd known exactly what he wanted. Not a boat, not a vacation. A piece of land where the water came to him, where he could sit at the end of a dock in the early morning and let his mind go quiet for the first time in 3 decades. He'd found Lakeside Ridge 4 years ago. The property was the last lakefront lot in the development, which should have raised questions but didn't, because the price was right and the dock was already there, a 16-foot cedar structure, professionally installed, sure permitted by the county in 2009, 7 years before the Lakeside Ridge HOA had been incorporated and begun issuing its architectural review standards and its violation notices on cream-colored paper with burgundy letterhead. The dock had sat dormant for 3 of those 4 years. Marcus's mother had gotten sick the autumn after he closed on the property, and he'd spent those years driving between Lakeside Ridge and Tacoma, managing her care, managing her affairs, managing the particular grief of watching someone you love diminish by degrees. He'd barely used the property, barely used the dock. When she passed in February, he'd come back to Lakeside Ridge with the specific intention of finally beginning the life he'd purchased this place to live. He'd spent March repairing the dock. They replaced 4 planks that had warped over the wet winters, refinished the cedar with a marine-grade sealant, installed new cleats and a small bench at the end, just wide enough for 1 person and a cup of coffee. He'd done the work himself, methodically, the way he did everything, measuring twice, cutting once, documenting each material and each hour in a small green notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. When he was finished, the dock looked exactly as it had when the county inspector had signed off on it in 2009. 16 feet of properly maintained, properly permitted, properly grandfathered lakefront structure. He pulled the notice from his pocket and read it again in the lake light. Lakeside Ridge. Homeowners Association. Notice of violation. Property address: 4417 Ridgeline Drive. Owner: Marcus T. Chen. Violation reference: Section 4.7.2. Architectural Review Standards. Description of violation: water-adjacent structure exceeding 12 feet in length, installed or maintained without board approval. Required action: structure must be removed or modified to compliance within 30 days of notice date. Failure to comply will result in fines of $500 per day, compounding, until the violation is remedied, or the matter is resolved through the board's compliance process. The notice was signed by Patricia Voss, Compliance Director. Marcus had never met Patricia Voss. He'd seen her once at a distance during a neighborhood meeting he'd attended in January. A trim woman in her late 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent years in an industry that rewarded the careful documentation of other people's losses. He'd heard from his neighbor, a retired school teacher named Elaine Marsh, who'd lived in Lakeside Ridge since the beginning, that Voss had been hired 8 months ago by the board's chairman, David Rothstein, specifically to professionalize the compliance function. Elaine had said this with the particular tone of someone describing a weather event they'd been warned about and hadn't quite believed. Marcus walked back up from the dock and went inside and found the folder he'd labeled Property, Permits and Documentation the day he closed on the house. He was that kind of man. Every permit, every inspection record, every piece of correspondence related to the property was in that folder, organized chronologically, with a typed index on the first page. He found the original county permit for the dock, issued May 14, 2009, signed by the county's chief building inspector, valid for the structure as described, 16 feet in length, cedar construction, fixed pier design. He found the grandfathering letter from the county, issued in 2017 when the HOA had first attempted to assert architectural review authority over lakefront structures, confirming that the dock predated the HOA's formation and was exempt from its architectural standards under state property law. He photographed both documents with his phone. Then he typed a careful, measured response to Patricia Voss, attached the photographs, and sent it to the email address on the letterhead. He explained the permit. He explained the grandfathering. He explained, without condescension, but with the precision of a man who had spent 3 decades making sure structures didn't fail, that the HOA's Section 4.7.2 did not apply to his dock and never had. He received a response 4 days later. It was also on cream-colored paper with burgundy letterhead, and it was also signed by Patricia Voss, and it said, in language that was careful and bureaucratic and entirely unmoved by anything he'd written, that the HOA's architectural review standards superseded county permitting in matters of community aesthetics and structural compliance, that the grandfathering letter he'd referenced applied to county code enforcement only and not to HOA covenant obligations, and that the 30-day compliance window had now been reduced to 26 days. Marcus read this letter standing at his kitchen counter. He set it down. He poured himself a glass of water from the tap and drank it slowly. Through the kitchen window, he could see the lake, and the dock, and the heron, which had moved from the far bank to the near one, and was standing in the shallows 12 feet from the end of his structure with the same expression of absolute patience it always wore. He thought about the waterway. He'd noticed it the first time he walked the full perimeter of his property. A channel, maybe 8 feet wide, that entered his land from the northeast corner through a concrete culvert and ran along the back edge of the property before disappearing beneath the road. He'd assumed it was a drainage feature, a common enough thing in the Pacific Northwest, where water management was a constant negotiation between human infrastructure and the landscape zone insistence. He'd noted it in his survey documents and filed it without much thought. But standing at his kitchen counter with Patricia Voss's letter in front of him, something stirred in the part of his mind that had spent 28 years reading landscapes for what they were actually doing beneath the surface. He'd seen the irrigation heads throughout the Lakeside Ridge common areas. He'd seen the decorative fountains at the entrance and at the community park. He'd seen, once, a maintenance crew working on something near the community's eastern fence line, with equipment that looked more substantial than lawn care required. He made a note in his green notebook. Just 3 words, the way an engineer marks something that needs further investigation before conclusions are drawn. Then he called the county assessor's office and requested the full property records for 4417 Ridgeline Drive including all easements, its encumbrances, and recorded agreements. He wasn't angry yet. Anger was imprecise, and imprecision was how structures failed. What he felt was something closer to the focused stillness that comes when you realize a problem is more interesting than it first appeared, when the numbers don't add up the way they should, and you understand that the discrepancy isn't an error, it's information. He picked up Patricia Voss's letter and filed it behind the permit documents in his folder. He updated the index, then he went down to the dock and sat on the bench he'd built at the end of it, and he watched the lake hold the sky, and he let himself think. The fine clock had started. $500 a day, compounding. Somewhere on the other side of the community, in a meeting room with a projector screen and a gavel, David Rothstein was almost certainly telling someone that Marcus Chen would fold within the week. Marcus watched the heron lift from the shallows in one long, unhurried motion, its wings catching the April light as it crossed the water and disappeared into the tree line on the far shore. He finished his coffee. The county permit office smelled like old carpet and toner fluid, the particular institutional scent of a building that had processed 10,000 ordinary lives without ceremony. Marcus Chen sat across from a clerk named Beverly. Her nameplate said Beverly, her expression said she had heard everything twice, and watched her pull up the records on a monitor that was at least 8 years behind the times. He had driven 40 minutes to get here. He had brought a folder. The folder was not thin. Inside it, the original building permit for the dock, issued April 14, 2001, stamped and signed by the county's Department of Public Works. A certificate of inspection from the same year, confirming the structure met all applicable codes at the time of construction. A property survey from 2003 that showed the dock's footprint, its dimensions, its relationship to the shoreline, and a single document that Marcus considered the most important piece of paper he owned, a grandfathering letter issued by the county in 2009 when the region updated its shoreline management regulations, explicitly noting that structures permitted before the revision date were exempt from the new dimensional requirements provided they remained in continuous use or were maintained by the original permit holder or their successor in title. Marcus had purchased the property in 2018. The grandfathering transferred with the deed. He had confirmed this with the title company at closing. He had kept the confirmation. Beverly scrolled through the database with the unhurried pace of someone who could not be rushed by anything short of a building fire. She found the permit. She found the inspection record. She cross-referenced the grandfathering letter against the county's internal notation system, and then she looked at Marcus over the top of her reading glasses. "Everything checks out," she said. "This dock has been in the county's system as a grandfathered structure since 2009. There's a notation here from the Shoreline Management Office. It's clean." Marcus asked if she could print him a certified copy of the permit history with the county seal. She could. She did. It cost him $4. He drove home with the certified copies on the passenger seat and spent that evening composing a letter to Patricia Voss. He was precise. He was not emotional. He cited the permit number, the inspection certificate number, the grandfathering letter reference number, and the relevant section of the county's shoreline management code. He attached copies of every document. He sent the letter by certified mail and also by email, with read receipts requested, and he photographed the envelope before he sealed it. Then he waited. The read receipt came back 40 minutes after he sent the email. Voss had opened it. He did not hear from her for 11 days. When her response arrived, it was a single page on HOA letterhead. The Lakeside Ridge Homeowners Association crest at the top. A little embossed lighthouse that Marcus had always found faintly absurd given that they lived on a freshwater lake in the interior Pacific Northwest, not a rocky Atlantic coastline. The letter was dated 3 days before it arrived, which meant she had sat on it. He read it twice, slowly, because he wanted to make sure he understood what she was actually saying. She was saying that the county's grandfathering documentation was noted. She was saying that the HOA appreciated his diligence in gathering the records. And then she was saying, in language that had clearly been reviewed by someone with at least a passing familiarity with legal phrasing, that the Lakeside Ridge HOA's governing documents operated independently of county permitting authority, for that Section 4.7.2 of the Architectural Review Standards applied to all water-adjacent structures within the community, regardless of prior permitting history, and that the violation notice remained in effect. She used the phrase community standards 4 times in one page. Marcus set the letter down on his kitchen table and looked out through the sliding glass door at the lake. The dock sat at the end of his property, 16 feet of pressure-treated lumber and composite decking. Professionally installed, structurally sound, entirely unremarkable. A neighbor 2 lots down had a dock that was, by Marcus's estimation, at least 20 feet long. He had measured it from the shore with his rangefinder one afternoon, not out of spite, but because he was an engineer and the question had presented itself. 22 feet, actually. And that dock had no violation notice. He wrote that down. He had started keeping a log the day the first notice arrived. A simple document, date-stamped entries, factual and unadorned. He recorded Voss's letter. He recorded the 11-day delay. He recorded the non-response to his specific legal arguments. He recorded the neighbor's dock dimensions and the absence of any corresponding enforcement action. He noted the date, the weather, the time. He was building something, though he could not yet have told you precisely what. The HOA board met on the 3rd Tuesday of every month in the community clubhouse, a cedar-sided building near the main gate with a view of the lake's northern shore. Marcus attended the next meeting. He signed in at the door, took a seat in the back row of folding chairs. Ian listened to 40 minutes of agenda items about the resurfacing of the tennis courts and a proposed amendment to the guest parking policy before the floor was opened for homeowner comments. He walked to the front. He had 3 minutes per the rules. He used 2.5. He presented the county permit documentation. He cited the grandfathering letter. He noted calmly that the HOA's own governing documents, he had read them, all 47 pages, did not contain any provision explicitly superseding pre-existing county permits or grandfathered structures. He asked the board to identify the specific legal authority under which they claimed jurisdiction over a structure that predated the HOA's formation by 7 years. David Rothstein sat at the center of the board table, with the particular stillness of a man who had decided in advance that nothing said in this room would change anything. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from golf rather than labor. He had developed 3 residential communities in the county over the past 15 years. Lakeside Ridge was the most profitable. He chaired the HOA board with the same energy he brought to everything, total confidence in his own authority, and a complete lack of interest in challenges to it. He let Marcus finish. He thanked him for his comments. He said the board had reviewed the matter thoroughly and that the violations stood. He said the HOA's legal counsel had confirmed their authority. He did not name the legal counsel. He did not produce any written opinion. He moved to the next agenda item. Marcus returned to his seat. He wrote down the time, 7:44 p.m. He wrote down what Rothstein had said, word for word as best he could reconstruct it. He wrote down that no written legal opinion had been produced or offered. Patricia Voss sat to Rothstein's left and did not look at Marcus once during his presentation. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her, and she wrote something on it while he spoke, though he could not see what. She had the focused, forward-leaning posture of someone who had decided that engagement was beneath them. There were 4 other board members. 2 of them looked at the table while Marcus spoke. 1 looked at her phone. The 4th, a man named Gerald Okafor, who Marcus knew slightly from neighborhood walks, who had always seemed decent, watched Marcus with an expression that was not quite sympathy, but was not hostility either. It was the expression of a man who understood something was wrong and had not yet decided what to do about it. Marcus noted that too. On his way out of the parking lot, he sat in his car for a moment and looked at the community's irrigation control panel, mounted on a post near the clubhouse entrance. It was a modest installation, a weatherproof box with a digital timer and a series of valve controls. He had noticed it before without thinking much about it. Tonight, for the first time, he found himself wondering where the water came from. The lake was the obvious answer, but the lake's shoreline along the community's common areas was largely decorative, shallow, reeded, not the kind of clean access point you'd use for a pump intake. The irrigation system was too robust for a simple shoreline draw. The fountains at the main entrance ran year-round. The fire suppression infrastructure, he had seen the hydrant housings near the community's perimeter, required pressurized water that a standard municipal connection alone might not reliably provide in this terrain. He was an engineer. These questions were reflexive. He drove home along the lake road and turned into his driveway and sat looking at his property in the dark. His land ran from the road down to the water, a gentle slope of about 200 feet, widening slightly toward the shore. The dock extended from a small natural promontory on the southern edge of his lot. On the northern edge, where the property line met the neighboring parcel, there was a low concrete structure half hidden by blackberry canes, something he had always assumed was a remnant of the original agricultural drainage system that had preceded the subdivision. He had never looked at it closely. He looked at it now, in the dark, from his driveway, and felt the first faint stirring of something he could not yet name. Not anger, not hope, something more like the sensation he used to get in his engineering days when a set of numbers that hadn't made sense suddenly began to resolve into a pattern. The quiet, electric feeling of a system revealing itself. He went inside. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the county assessor's records for his property and the surrounding parcels. He pulled up the county's GIS mapping system, which was publicly accessible and more detailed than most people realized. He zoomed in on his lot, on the lake, on the network of drainage and water management infrastructure that threaded through the subdivision. He found something. He didn't understand it yet, but he found it. He wrote the time in his log, 9:17 p.m., and noted that further research was required. Then he closed the laptop and went to bed, because he had learned long ago that the most important thing about a long fight was knowing when to rest. The fines were still running. $500 a day, compounding. He knew that. He had calculated the trajectory. He knew exactly where it was going. He was not afraid of where it was going. The first check Marcus wrote to his attorney cost him $800. The second cost him $1,200. By the time October arrived and the maples along the lakeshore had gone the color of old rust, he had spent nearly $4,000 in legal consultation fees to defend a dock that had cost him $6,000 to build and had never, in 3 years of sitting quietly over the water, harmed a single person or violated a single county ordinance. He kept the receipts in a manila folder. He kept everything in manila folders now. There were 11 of them arranged in a milk crate beside his desk, each one labeled in his precise engineer's hand, each one a chapter in a story he had not chosen to write. The fines had not stopped at the first notice. That was the thing people outside this situation never quite understood when he tried to explain it at the hardware store or over coffee with his neighbor Gil Tanaka, who listened with the careful sympathy of a man who suspected he might be next. The fines were not a one-time penalty. They were a mechanism. Patricia Voss had designed them that way, or had found them already designed in the HOA's enforcement matrix, and had applied them with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting her whole professional life for a document that gave her this kind of reach. $500 per day. Compounding. The word compounding appeared in the original violation notice in bold typeface, as though the HOA's document designer had understood that this was the word that would land hardest, the word that would make a reasonable person fold. Marcus was a civil engineer. He understood compounding better than Patricia Voss did. He had spent 28 years calculating load tolerances and stress fractures and the slow accumulation of pressure on structures that looked solid from the outside. He ran the numbers the morning after the second notice arrived, sitting at his kitchen table with the lake visible through the window, flat and grey under an October sky. At $500 per day, he would reach $10,000 in 20 days. He would reach $50,000 in 100 days. He circled the number on his legal pad and sat with it for a long time. The second notice had arrived certified mail. Voss had attached a cover letter that referred to Marcus's county permits as fraudulent documents of historical interest that held no bearing on the HOA's current architectural standards. The phrase was so precisely condescending that Marcus read it 3 times to make sure he had not misunderstood it. He photographed the letter, placed it in folder number 4, and called Susan Waverley. Waverley told him what he already suspected. The HOA's position was legally aggressive, but not, in the short term, easily dismissed. Washington State gave homeowners associations significant latitude in enforcing their own covenants. And while the grandfathering argument was strong, it would require a court to say so. Courts took time. Fines did not wait for courts. What Waverley did not yet know, what neither of them knew in October, was that the fines were only the surface of the problem. The surface was bad enough. By the time the third notice arrived in early November, the running total had crossed $18,000. Marcus received this information on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in his driveway with an envelope in his hand and the smell of wood smoke coming off the water. He stood there long enough that Gil Tanaka, in walking his retriever along the road, stopped and asked if he was all right. Marcus said he was fine. He was not fine, but he was not broken either, which was what the HOA was counting on. The board met on the second Thursday of every month in the community clubhouse, a cedar-sided building that sat at the north end of the development on a small rise above the retention pond. Marcus had attended 2 of these meetings since the violation notices began. The first time, he had been civil and precise, presenting his permits and his grandfathering documentation in a 3-ring binder with tabbed sections. Rothstein had listened with the patient expression of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the presentation to end. Voss had taken notes. The vote to uphold the violation had been 4-0, and with 1 abstention from a board member named Carla Ostrowski, who had the decency to look uncomfortable. The second time Marcus attended, he brought Waverley. Her presence changed the temperature of the room in a way that was immediately visible. Rothstein's jaw had tightened. Voss had stopped smiling. The HOA's own attorney, a soft-spoken man named Gerald Pruitt, who handled 3 other associations in the county and clearly wished he were handling any of them tonight, had asked for a recess that lasted 22 minutes. When they returned, Pruitt offered a settlement. The fines would be frozen at their current level if Marcus agreed to submit a formal architectural review application for the dock. Waverley had asked with genuine curiosity what the review process entailed. Pruitt explained that the application would go to the Architectural Committee, which would evaluate the structure against current standards, and that a decision could be expected within 60 to 90 days. Waverley asked who sat on the Architectural Committee. Pruitt said the committee was appointed by the board. Waverley said thank you and told Marcus they were leaving. In the parking lot, under a sky that had gone completely dark and cold, she told him that the review process was a trap. Submit the application and you're implicitly acknowledging their authority over the structure. They deny it, the fines resume, and now you've handed them a procedural argument. She said it with the calm of someone who had watched this particular mechanism operate before in other communities, but against other homeowners who had made the mistake of engaging with a process that was designed to produce only one outcome. Marcus drove home along the lake road. The water was invisible in the dark, but he could hear it, a faint movement against the shore, the sound the lake made when the wind came down from the north. He had bought this property for that sound as much as anything else, for the particular quality of quiet that existed at the edge of water, the way it absorbed the noise of the world and gave back something slower and more honest. He parked in his driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The dock was there in the darkness, a shadow extending over the water. 16 feet of pressure-treated lumber and galvanized hardware, permitted and inspected and grandfathered and entirely, completely legal under every authority that actually had jurisdiction over it. The HOA had no jurisdiction over it. Waverley had said this repeatedly, with increasing certainty, as she dug deeper into the property records. What she had found in those records, and what she had mentioned to Marcus only briefly, in the careful way attorneys mention things they are still verifying, was that the waterway running along the eastern edge of his property was not simply a scenic feature of the landscape. It was functional infrastructure, the retention system that managed stormwater for the entire development, that fed the irrigation network keeping Lakeside Ridge's lawns the particular shade of green that Rothstein used in his marketing materials, that supplied the pressure to the emergency fire suppression lines. All of it ran through a corridor that crossed Marcus's land, had always crossed Marcus's land. The easement that authorized this crossing was 15 years old and had been negotiated by Rothstein's own development company before the HOA existed, before half the houses in the community were built, before Patricia Voss had ever heard of Section 4.7.2. Marcus did not fully understand yet what this meant. He understood it the way you understand a structural calculation before you've run it completely. You can see the shape of the answer before you have the number. Something was load-bearing here. Something that the HOA had been treating as background, as given, as permanent and unconditional, was in fact conditional, was in fact his. He went inside and added the third notice to folder number 4. The running total was $18,500. He wrote the number on the outside of the folder in red ink because he wanted to be able to see it from across the room. He wanted to remember, when this was over, exactly what it had cost to be right. The lake was quiet outside his window. The dock sat over the water in the dark, patient and still, the way structures are patient when they have been built correctly and have nothing to prove. Somewhere on the other side of the development, the retention pond was doing what it always did, holding water, moving water, keeping the whole careful system of Lakeside Ridge alive and green and valuable, moving it through the corridor that crossed his land, burnt through the access that no one had ever thought to ask his permission to use. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. In the morning he would call Waverley and ask her to tell him everything she had found. Susan Waverley's office smelled like old paper and cold coffee, and Marcus had come to associate both smells with the particular quality of attention she brought to a problem. She didn't pace. She didn't perform urgency. She sat behind a desk stacked with manila folders and read with the focused stillness of someone defusing something. And when she finally looked up at him across the width of that desk, he understood that she had found something worth diffusing. "Tell me what you know about your property's water infrastructure," she said. It wasn't the question he expected. He had come prepared to discuss the fines, the compounding penalties, the HOA's procedural failures, the paper trail he had spent 3 months assembling with the same methodical precision he had once applied to drainage calculations and load-bearing specifications. He had a binder. He had tabs. He had expected her to want the binder. She was looking at a survey map instead. Marcus leaned forward. The map was old, the kind produced before digital drafting, hand-rendered with ink lines that had faded to the color of weak tea. He recognized the shape of his property immediately. The irregular western boundary, the slope down to the water, the dock, represented by a small rectangular notation at the lake's edge. But there was something else on the map, a line he didn't recognize. It ran from the lake's northern inlet, crossed the lower portion of his property, in a gentle diagonal, and disappeared into what was now the community's eastern landscaping corridor. "That's a waterway, Howard," he said. "But it's more than a waterway." Waverley set down a second document beside the map. It's a man-made retention channel, installed 15 years ago as part of the community's original development infrastructure. It feeds the irrigation network for all of Lakeside Ridge's common areas, the landscaping, the entrance fountains, the decorative ponds along the main boulevard. She paused. "And the emergency fire suppression system." Marcus studied the line on the map. He had known, in the vague way that property owners know things they've never needed to examine closely, that there was some kind of drainage feature on the lower edge of his land. He had assumed it was a natural runoff channel, or he had never needed to think about it more carefully than that. "It runs through my property," he said, "through the southwest corner, approximately 40 linear feet of active channel on your land before it enters the community easement corridor." Waverley opened the second document and turned it toward him. "This is the conservation easement filed with the county 15 years ago. The developer, Rothstein's company, Meridian Land Group, negotiated it as a condition of the community's development permit. The county required a managed retention system to satisfy environmental impact requirements. Rothstein agreed." Marcus read the language slowly. The easement was dense with legal terminology, but the structural logic was clear enough for an engineer to pass. The retention channel had been designed to draw from the lake's northern inlet, cross the lower portion of the adjacent private parcel, his parcel, and feed into the community's irrigation and suppression infrastructure through a series of controlled valves and pumping stations. "Keats, the access corridor," he said, reading further. "The easement grants access to the channel for maintenance purposes." "Aids, yes, and here's where it becomes interesting." Waverley's voice carried the particular flatness of someone who has learned to deliver significant information without inflection, because inflection can be mistaken for interpretation. "The access corridor runs across your property, not through the community's common areas, not through any HOA-controlled land, across your private property. The easement grants the county, and by extension, I'm the infrastructure operator, the right to access the channel for maintenance, but it does not grant the HOA that right." The room was quiet for a moment. "The HOA has been crossing my property," Marcus said. "For 15 years informally. There's no recorded agreement between you and the HOA. There's no license, there's no easement in their favor. The original developer assumed the relationship between the property owner and the community would be cooperative and never formalized it. When you purchased the property, there was no disclosure of the informal access arrangement because nobody thought it needed disclosing." She paused. Nobody thought the HOA would ever give the property owner a reason to care. Marcus sat back in his chair. He was thinking about the maintenance crews he had occasionally seen near the lower fence line. He had assumed they were county workers. He had waved at them once or twice and thought nothing of it. He was thinking about the valve housing he had noticed half buried in the slope near the water's edge, which he had assumed was some kind of county drainage infrastructure, and had therefore left undisturbed. He was thinking about Patricia Voss, who had stood in his driveway 8 months ago with a clipboard and a violation notice and the absolute institutional confidence of someone who had never considered the possibility that the person she was citing might own something she needed. "So what does this mean for the fines?" he asked. The fines are a separate matter and we'll address them. The HOA's authority over your dock is legally questionable on its own. The grandfathering documentation is solid, and their claim that bylaws supersede county permits is not well supported in state case law. We have a strong argument that the fines are unenforceable. Waverly folded her hands on the desk. But the waterway changes the geometry of this entirely. It means the HOA is not simply a body that overreached its authority in issuing you a violation. It's a body that has been relying on your property, your private property, for 15 years without any legal right to do so. And when they decided to make an enemy of you, they did it while standing on ground they don't own. Marcus looked at the survey map again. The diagonal line crossing the lower corner of his property. 40 feet of channel. 15 years of unexamined assumption. I want a hydrological engineer, Honsuk, he said. I want to know exactly how dependent that system is on the access corridor. I want flow rates. I want infrastructure diagrams. I want to understand what happens to the community's water supply if that access point becomes unavailable. Waverly nodded. She had already written the name of a firm on a notepad and slid it across the desk before he finished the sentence. There's one more thing, she said. I filed the public records request with the county 3 weeks ago. The HOA's correspondence with the county planning office. Their internal communications that were submitted as part of the original development filing. She opened a third folder. Can I receive the response yesterday? The documents inside were printed emails. The timestamps ran back 18 months. Marcus read the first one and felt something settle in his chest. Not anger exactly, but the specific cold clarity of a man who has spent months wondering whether he was wrong about something and has just received confirmation that he was not. The email was from David Rothstein to Patricia Voss. It was dated 6 weeks before the first violation notice arrived in Marcus's mailbox. It referenced, in passing, the easement. It referenced, in slightly more careful language, the question of whether Marcus was likely to retain legal counsel. The phrase Rothstein had used was unlikely to push back given the complexity of the documentation. Marcus read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk with the same deliberate care he had once used to set down a completed set of engineering drawings. The gesture of a man who has finished one phase of work and is ready to begin the next. They knew more, he said. They knew about the easement. They knew about the potential complications. And they decided to proceed anyway, because they calculated that you wouldn't understand what you are holding. Waverly closed the folder. That calculation is going to be the most expensive mistake David Rothstein has made in a long time. Marcus looked at the survey map one final time, the line crossing his property. The channel that fed the fountains and the lawns and the fire suppression system of a community whose board had fined him $50,000 for a dock that had been legally permitted before their organization existed. He thought about the word leverage, about what it meant in engineering, where a small force applied at the correct point could move an object of enormous mass. He had spent his career understanding that principle. He had applied it to bridges and retaining walls and drainage systems. He was beginning to understand that he had been living on top of a lever for 15 years without knowing it. What's our next step? He asked. Waverly picked up her pen. We start measuring, she said. Susan Waverly had a habit that Marcus noticed on their third meeting. Whenever she found something important in a document, she didn't react immediately. She set the paper down. She pressed her fingertips together. She looked at the middle distance for exactly 3 seconds, as though she were doing a calculation no one else could see. Then she picked the document back up and read it again. She did it twice in the span of 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and Marcus, who had spent 28 years reading the body language of engineers who had just found a structural problem, understood that whatever Susan Waverly had found in the county recorder's archive was not small. The first document was a plat map. The second was 41 pages long, single-spaced, dated September 14, 2009, and stamped in blue ink across its cover page with the seal of the Pacific County Conservation Authority. Waverley had requested it 3 weeks earlier through a routine title search, the kind of procedural excavation that property rights attorneys conduct the way archaeologists conduct a dig. Slowly, methodically, with the understanding that the most significant thing you find is almost never the thing you were looking for. She slid it across the conference table to Marcus without saying anything. He read the title. He read it again. Conservation, Easement and Access Corridor Agreement. Lakeside Ridge Development, LLC, Parcel 7741-A, recorded in perpetuity. Parcel 7741-A was his property. He looked up at her. She had her fingertips pressed together. Tell me what I'm reading, he said. You're reading, Waverley said. Very the reason David Rothstein has been hoping you wouldn't hire a lawyer. She walked him through it in the careful, sequential way she explained everything. Not because she thought Marcus wasn't intelligent, but because she had learned that even intelligent people needed to hear certain things assembled in order, like load-bearing walls, before the full weight of a structure became visible. 15 years ago, when Lakeside Ridge was still a developer's rendering on a conference room wall, Rothstein's company had a problem. The land they'd purchased for the subdivision sat adjacent to a man-made retention system, a series of connected channels and a central basin that the county had built in the 1990s as part of a regional stormwater management project. The retention system was functional infrastructure. It fed a network of underground irrigation lines that would eventually service the community's landscaping, its decorative fountains, its green spaces. More critically, it was integrated into the fire suppression infrastructure, a secondary water source that the county fire marshal required for any residential development of more than 40 units that sat more than a quarter mile from the nearest municipal hydrant. Lakeside Ridge had 62 units. It sat 3/8 of a mile from the nearest hydrant. The retention system was not negotiable. It had to be accessible. It had to be maintained. And the only viable access corridor, the only route that didn't require crossing protected wetlands or condemning an adjacent agricultural parcel, ran directly through the property that would eventually be sold to Marcus Chen. Rothstein's company had negotiated the easement with the county. They'd done it quietly, buried it in the development agreement, and recorded it with the county in a way that was entirely legal and entirely invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. The easement granted a permanent access corridor across the rear portion of Marcus's parcel, a 20-foot wide strip running from the community's eastern boundary down to the waterway's primary maintenance access point, which sat, as it happened, at the base of the slope where Marcus had installed his dock, the dock that Patricia Voss had declared illegal, the dock that the HOA had been fining him $500 a day to remove. Marcus set the document down. He looked at the plat map, at the thin dotted line that marked the easement corridor, at the way it terminated at the water's edge in a small annotated square labeled Access Point. Maintenance and emergency use. They built their access point under my dock, he said. Well, effectively, yes, Waverley said. The dock post placement is directly adjacent to the maintenance access point, not on top of it. The dock doesn't physically obstruct the access point itself, but the practical reality is that for 15 years, the maintenance crews have been using your dock as a staging area. They tie off to it. They use it to access the intake valve. Without it, the access point is still technically reachable, but it requires wading through 3 feet of water or bringing in specialized equipment. And the HOA has been using my dock for 15 years without asking. Or without asking, without compensating you, and without ever mentioning it when they decided to fine you $50,000 for having it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the October rain was doing what October rain in the Pacific Northwest does, not falling so much as existing, a grey ambient presence that made the world feel enclosed and close, Does the easement give them the right to use the dock? He asked. The easement grants access to the corridor and the maintenance point. It says nothing about any structures on the property. The dock isn't mentioned because the dock didn't exist when the easement was recorded. The county has the right to access the waterway for maintenance. The HOA, as the successor entity responsible for the infrastructure, has derivative access rights. But those rights are to the access point, not to your dock, not to your property beyond the 20-foot corridor, and not to any structure you've built. So they've been trespassing. Every time a maintenance crew tied off to your dock, technically, yes. Waverley allowed herself a small, precise smile. But that's almost secondary to the larger issue. The larger issue was this. The waterway wasn't decorative. It wasn't the picturesque lake that Lakeside Ridge's marketing materials had always implied. The shimmering backdrop for property listings. The reason the community's name included the word ridge and not the word subdivision. It was functional infrastructure. It fed the irrigation system that kept 62 properties' lawns and landscaping alive. It fed the fountains at the community entrance that Rothstein had used in every sales brochure, and it fed the fire suppression reserve that the county required to be maintained at a minimum capacity of 40,000 gallons at all times. The HOA managed that infrastructure. They paid for its maintenance. They depended on it completely. And the only legal access corridor to maintain it ran across Marcus Chen's property. Waverley had already spoken to a hydrological engineer named Robert Castillo, who had spent 2 days reviewing the system's design documents and walking the terrain. His preliminary assessment was unambiguous. Without regular access to the primary maintenance point, the intake valve that regulated the retention system's water level could not be serviced. Without servicing, the system would gradually lose capacity. The irrigation network would degrade within 1 season. The fire suppression reserve would fall below the county's minimum threshold within 6 to 8 months, depending on rainfall. At that point, the county fire marshal would be required to act. Marcus read Castillo's preliminary report twice. He read the section about the fire suppression threshold 3 times. They don't know we have this, he said. It wasn't a question. Rothstein knows the easement exists, Waverley said. He negotiated it. He recorded it. What he apparently believed. And I want you to understand that this is supported by the internal emails we obtained, is that you didn't know it existed. The title search you received when you purchased the property should have flagged it, but it was recorded under the development agreement rather than as a standalone encumbrance. And it was missed. Rothstein's company knew it was missed. There's an email from 2019, 2 years after you purchased the property, in which Rothstein's assistant asked whether the Chen easement disclosure had been made. Rothstein's response was 4 words. She slid a printed email across the table. Marcus read it. Not our problem now. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something fragile, or something that might otherwise cause you to do something you'd regret. He sold me a property with an undisclosed easement, Marcus said. He sold you a property with an undisclosed easement, then 2 years later began fining you for a dock that his community's infrastructure depends on, while possessing internal knowledge that the fines were legally questionable and that you were unlikely to discover the easement without professional legal help. Waverley paused. I've been doing this for 11 years. I've seen HOA overreach. I've seen bad faith governance. What I'm looking at here is something more specific. This is a board chairman who understood his own vulnerability and decided the safest strategy was to bully you into compliance before you could find it. The rain pressed against the window. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and was answered and went quiet. Marcus thought about the violation notice, the one that had arrived on a Saturday morning in April with its formal language and its 30-day deadline, and its tone of absolute institutional certainty. He thought about Patricia Voss standing at her compliance director's desk, drafting that notice with the zealot's confidence of someone who has never considered that the ground beneath her authority might not be solid. He thought about the board meeting where they'd voted unanimously to uphold the violation, all 5 of them sitting in their community room with their agendas and their Robert's Rules of Order, performing the theatre of governance while Rothstein sat at the head of the table, knowing exactly what he'd done and betting that Marcus Chen, retired engineer, widower, quiet man, would simply pay. He thought about the $50,000 in fines sitting in a demand letter on his kitchen counter. He thought about the waterway running behind his property, cold and functional, and entirely indifferent to the human drama being conducted along its banks. "What do we do with this?" he asked. Waverley picked up her pen. "First, we finish building the record. We get Castillo's full report. We get the public records request completed on the board communications. We file the regulatory complaint." She looked at him steadily. "And then we give them one opportunity to make this right. And if they don't, then we let them make their next move," she said. "Because whatever they do next, they'll be doing it on ground that belongs to you." Marcus nodded slowly. He looked at the easement document one more time, at the dotted line on the plat map, at the small square at the water's edge, at the access point that an entire community's infrastructure ran through without ever acknowledging whose land it crossed. He picked up the document and set it in his folder with the same deliberate care he'd given every piece of paper in this fight. He was not a man who raged. He was a man who measured twice and cut once. He was beginning to understand exactly what he was going to cut. The emails arrived in a manila folder, printed on plain white paper, and Susan Waverley set them on Marcus's kitchen table, the way a surgeon sets down an instrument before explaining what it found. Not dramatic, not rushed, with the particular quietness of someone who has learned that the most devastating information requires no performance. Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee. He sat down. He read. The first email was dated 14 months ago, 3 weeks before Patricia Voss had ever knocked on his door or slid a violation notice into his mailbox. It was from David Rothstein to Voss, sent from his personal account rather than the HOA's official correspondence system. A detail Waverley had flagged in the margin with a single red asterisk. The subject line read, "Chen Property, Waterway Question." The body of the email was 11 sentences long. Marcus read it 4 times. Rothstein had written, "I've had the easement documents reviewed. The access corridor runs through his lot, which predates our formation. Technically, we have no authority to compel removal of any structure that was permitted before 2009. However, the dock issue gives us an opening. If we can establish a pattern of non-compliance on his part, we create leverage. He's been quiet for 3 years. He probably doesn't know what he's sitting on. Push the boundary. If he lawyers up, we reassess. My read is, he won't." Marcus set the paper down. He picked up his coffee. He did not say anything for a long moment. Waverley watched him the way she always watched clients when they first understood the full shape of what had been done to them. Not with sympathy exactly, but with a careful attention, ready for whatever came next. Some people cried. Some people went cold. Some people wanted to call the board members directly, which she always had to talk them out of. Marcus said he knew before she ever sent the first notice. "Yes. As the grandfathering documentation I submitted in April. The county permits. He already knew those were valid when Voss dismissed them." "The second email confirms it," Waverley said. She reached across the table and turned the page. The second email was Voss's reply, sent 40 minutes after Rothstein's. Her tone was the tone Marcus had come to recognize from every interaction with her, clipped, procedural, the language of someone who had confused the enforcement of rules with the possession of righteousness. She wrote, "Understood. I'll proceed with Section 4.7.2. The language is broad enough to cover pre-existing structures if we argue the refinishing work constitutes new construction. He submitted for a repair permit with the county in March. We can use that as the trigger. I'll document everything as standard compliance. Standard compliance. Marcus turned the word over in his mind the way you turn a stone and find the underside wet and dark. There were 6 more emails in the folder. Waverley walked him through each one, with the methodical patience that Marcus had come to understand was her greatest professional asset. Not her courtroom presence, not her knowledge of property law, but her absolute refusal to be hurried when the facts were doing the work themselves. The 3rd email, sent by Rothstein to the full board 2 days before the initial violation notice, was the one that would matter most in court. It was brief. It said, moving forward on Chen, Patricia has the approach. Vote to uphold when it comes to the floor. Unanimous preferred. The waterway situation is sensitive, and I'd rather resolve it through compliance pressure than litigation. If he pushes back hard, we'll need to revisit, but I don't anticipate that. The board had voted unanimously. Every member. 3 weeks after Rothstein told them the legal ground was uncertain, told them the easement predated their authority, told them Marcus's permits were likely valid, they had sat in the Lakeside Ridge community room with its recessed lighting and its laminated agenda sheets, and they had raised their hands and they had voted to fine a man $50,000 for a dock they knew they had no legal right to touch. Marcus thought about those hands going up. He thought about it with a stillness that surprised him. The public records request, he said. How did you get internal board emails? Waverley allowed herself a small, precise smile. Rothstein's company manages the HOA's administrative services under a contract. That contract routes through a county-registered community management entity, which means certain communications are subject to public records disclosure under state statute. He set up the governance structure himself 15 years ago, and he never anticipated that the same structure that gave him control would give someone else access. He built the trap he's standing in. People usually do, Waverley said. She refilled her own coffee and opened the second folder, the one that had arrived from the hydrological engineer 3 days earlier. Marcus had already read this one twice, but Waverley wanted to walk through it together because the waterway documentation was going to be the spine of everything that came next, and she needed to be certain Marcus understood not just what it said, but what it meant in the specific context of what they were about to do. The engineer's name was Robert Calloway, and he had spent 30 years working for the Army Corps of Engineers before going into private practice. His report was 41 pages long and written in the dense, unsentimental language of someone who had testified in federal court enough times to know that precision was the only protection against being taken apart on cross-examination. The core finding was this: the waterway that ran along the eastern boundary of Marcus's property and through the access corridor was not incidental infrastructure. It was the primary water source for the entire Lakeside Ridge irrigation network, 340 residential lots, the community's 3 decorative fountains, the retention ponds that fed the fire suppression system, and the groundwater recharge basin that the county had approved as part of the original development permit. The system processed an estimated 180,000 gallons per day during peak summer months. The access corridor on Marcus's property was the only maintenance point for the primary intake valve, the filtration junction, and the emergency shutoff controls. There was no secondary access route. There had never been one built because the developer, Rothstein's company, had relied on the informal understanding that the property owner would simply allow access, and as Marcus's predecessors had done for 15 years, without complaint or compensation. That informal understanding had never been codified. It had never been negotiated. It had never been offered anything in exchange. Calloway's report noted, in the flat declarative sentences of an engineer who understood exactly what he was writing, that if access to the maintenance corridor were restricted, the HOA would have no legal mechanism to service the intake valve, no ability to operate the emergency shutoff in the event of a system failure, and no practical means of maintaining the filtration junction that kept the water supply within county health standards. He estimated that without regular maintenance access, the system would begin showing degradation within 30 to 45 days. He estimated that in the event of a significant failure, a valve rupture, a filtration breach, a pressure event, the HOA would have no ability to respond without crossing private property, for which they held no easement rights and no permission. The county fire marshal, Callaway noted in his final paragraph, had conducted a routine inspection of the fire suppression infrastructure 18 months ago and had flagged the access situation as a potential liability. The flag had been filed. No action had been taken. The HOA had not disclosed it to homeowners. Marcus closed the folder. Outside his kitchen window, the lake was flat and silver in the early morning light. The dock extended from his property in the clean, modest way it always had. 16 feet of treated lumber, 2 cleats, but a small bench at the end where he sometimes sat with coffee when the mornings were good. It had been there, in various forms, since before Lakeside Ridge existed, before the HOA's first meeting, before David Rothstein had ever drawn a site plan for this community or calculated what the lakefront lots would sell for. "Keep when we file," Marcus said. "Well, what does the timeline look like?" "We file the property rights suit and the state regulatory complaint simultaneously. The state complaint triggers an automatic review period. The HOA has to respond within 30 days and provide documentation of their enforcement practices. That's when the selective enforcement pattern becomes visible to a third party with actual authority." Waverley paused. The property rights suit is where the emails become the story. Rothstein knew, Voss knew, the board knew. They proceeded anyway and accumulated $50,000 in fines against a man whose legal standing they had privately acknowledged was sound. That's not a compliance dispute. That's a coordinated campaign. And the waterway. The waterway. Waverley said, is separate. The waterway is yours. What you do with access to your own property is a matter of property rights, not HOA governance. They have no authority over it. They never did. They've been crossing your land for 15 years on the assumption that you'd never look closely enough to notice. Marcus nodded slowly. He looked at the dog. He had built his life around precision, around the understanding that structures either met their specifications or they didn't, that load-bearing calculations either held or they failed, that the difference between a sound foundation and a compromised one was not a matter of opinion, but of fact. He had spent 28 years in civil engineering because he believed that the physical world had rules that could not be argued away by someone with a louder voice or a more aggressive posture. The HOA had spent 14 months trying to convince him that their authority was a physical fact, that their bylaws were load-bearing, that the violation notices and the compounding fines and the unanimous board votes were the kind of structure that a reasonable man simply accepted because the alternative was too costly to consider. They had miscalculated the kind of man he was. They had also, more fatally, miscalculated what he owned. "I want to respond to their settlement offer," Marcus said. "We're the one where they drop the fines if I remove the dock." Waverley raised an eyebrow. "You want to accept?" "I want to decline, idea," Marcus said. "In writing, with a full explanation of why. I want Rothstein to read it and understand exactly what's coming." Waverley considered this for a moment. Then she nodded. "I'll draft it this afternoon." "One more thing, Marcus said. He turned away from the window. "The maintenance access, the intake valve, the emergency shutoff, Has anyone from the HOA ever formally requested permission to cross my property? Any letter, any agreement, any acknowledgement that the access is mine to grant or withhold? Waverley's expression answered the question before she did. Not once, she said. In 15 years. Not a single document. Marcus picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the dock one more time. The dock they had fined him $50,000 to remove. The dock that sat on property they had no authority over, adjacent to a waterway they had no right to access, in a community built on the assumption that the man at the end of the easement would never, under any circumstances, look up from his grief and his quiet life and understand what he was holding. Then they've been trespassing, Marcus said, for every single day. He said it without heat, without satisfaction even. He said it the way an engineer reads a structural report, with the calm, absolute recognition of a fact that has always been true, that was always going to be true, and that no amount of violation notices or compounding fines or unanimous board votes was ever going to change. The morning Marcus chose to remove the dock, indeed he made coffee before dawn. Not because he couldn't sleep, he slept fine. He made it because the act of measuring grounds, of watching water heat to the precise temperature before it touched the filter, was the kind of deliberate, unhurried motion that had governed his entire professional life. Civil engineers did not rush, they calculated. They waited for conditions to stabilize. Then, they acted. He stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and watched the lake go from black to grey to the particular shade of pewter that meant the sun was still 40 minutes away. The dock extended from his shoreline like a pointing finger. 16 feet of pressure-treated lumber, galvanized hardware, a cleat on the far end where he had always imagined tying a small aluminum boat. He had never owned a boat. He had always meant to. He did not feel grief about the dock. He had processed that months ago, somewhere between the 43rd and 44th day of compounding fines, when the number on paper had crossed $30,000, and he had understood with complete clarity that the structure itself was no longer the point. The dock was a prop now. It had a final role to play, and today was the performance. Susan Waverley had called him the night before, not to review the plan. They had reviewed it enough times that both of them could recite it in sequence without notes, but simply to ask if he was ready. He told her he was. She said good, because after today there was no version of this where the HOA could claim any kind of moral or procedural high ground. He told her he understood that. She said she knew he did. And then she said something he had not expected. She said she was proud of how he had handled this. Not the legal strategy. Him, the person. He thanked her and meant it. At 7:15 the contractor arrived, a man named Delvecchio who ran a small marine construction outfit out of a yard 20 minutes south. Marcus had hired him originally to inspect the dock 2 springs ago, before any of this had started, and Delvecchio had told him then that the structure was sound, well built, that whoever had put it in originally had known what they were doing. Now Delvecchio backed his flatbed down the gravel path to the shoreline and climbed out and looked at the dock and looked at Marcus and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Are you sure about this?" Marcus said, I'm sure." Delvecchio nodded once, like the way tradesmen nod when they've decided that a client's reasons are their own business. He pulled on his work gloves and walked to the back of the flatbed to unload equipment. They had an audience by 8 o'clock. Marcus had not announced the removal. He had not needed to. Patricia Voss had been monitoring his property with the dedication of someone who had made his compliance her personal metric of professional success. And within 30 minutes of Delvecchio's arrival, she was standing at the edge of the common area path that ran along the north side of his property line, arms folded, wearing the expression of a person who has won something and wants to be present for the confirmation. 2 other board members materialized behind her. Marcus recognized them, but did not acknowledge them. He stood near the water's edge with his coffee, now cold, and watched Delvecchio work. The decking came up in sections. The hardware was methodical. Del Vecchio's assistant, a young man who worked without speaking, stacked the lumber on the flatbed with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again. The galvanized cleats came off. The support posts required more effort. They had been set properly, anchored well, and extracting them left clean holes in the lakebed sediment that filled slowly with dark water. By 9:30, the dock was gone. What remained was a shoreline. Just shoreline. Grass running to gravel, running to water, the way it had looked before Marcus's predecessor had built the structure. Before the HOA had existed, before any of this, the lake received the absence without comment. Voss said something to the board members behind her. Marcus could not hear the words, but he recognized the body language of institutional satisfaction, the slight loosening of a person who has been rigid for so long that relaxation looks like a different kind of tension. She took photographs with her phone, for the record, for the files, for whatever internal documentation system she maintained that gave her professional life its architecture. Marcus watched her photograph his empty shoreline and felt nothing except a quiet, focused attention. The way he had felt in his engineering years, when a demolition phase completed on schedule and the next phase was already loaded and waiting. Because what Voss was photographing was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the mechanism. The waterway that ran beneath the eastern edge of Marcus's property was not visible from where she stood. It had never been visible to most of Lakeside Ridge's residents, which was precisely how it had remained unexamined for 15 years. It ran underground for 60 feet, surfacing in a concrete-lined channel behind Marcus's property shed before continuing south toward the retention basin that fed the community's irrigation network. The channel was unobtrusive. It looked like drainage infrastructure, which in a functional sense it was, except that it was also the arterial supply for every sprinkler head, every ornamental fountain, every landscaped median in Lakeside Ridge's common areas, and the emergency suppression lines that the fire marshal had signed off on when the community was built ran from the same source. The easement that authorized the HOA's use of that waterway ran across Marcus's land. It had always run across Marcus's land. For 15 years, the HOA had maintained informal access to the channel's surface infrastructure through a gate in Marcus's fence that the original developer had installed and that Marcus had inherited along with the property. Nobody had ever formalized the access arrangement because nobody had ever imagined it would need to be formalized. It was one of those agreements that functions on assumption, on the mutual convenience of parties who have not yet found reason to examine its foundations. Marcus had found reason. Waverley had filed the formal access restriction notice the previous afternoon, time to arrive at the HOA's registered address at close of business. The notice was precise and legally immaculate. It did not claim to terminate the easement. The easement was a county instrument, and Marcus had no authority to terminate it unilaterally. What it did was something more surgical. It formally withdrew the informal surface access that the HOA had used to maintain the channel infrastructure. The gate in the fence would be locked. Any maintenance personnel requiring access to the waterway infrastructure on Marcus's property would need to submit a formal access request, which would be reviewed in light of the outstanding legal disputes between the parties. The outstanding legal disputes that the HOA had created, the fines they had levied, the harassment that Waverley's complaint had already placed before the State Regulatory Board. The dock was gone. Voss had her photographs. The board had their compliance, and the mechanism was already in motion. Marcus finished the cold coffee and set the mug on the porch railing. Del Vecchio was securing the last of the lumber on the flatbed, running a strap across the load with the practiced efficiency of a man who respected his equipment. The young assistant was raking the gravel at the shoreline, smoothing the disturbance left by the post extraction, which Marcus had not asked him to do but appreciated. The lake was fully lit now, the pewter gone, the surface catching the late morning sun in flat silver panels that shifted as the light moved. It was a beautiful piece of water. Marcus had known that when he bought the property. He had known it every morning since. He looked at the empty shoreline where the dock had been. Then he walked inside, picked up his phone, and sent Waverley a single word. "Done." Her reply came in under a minute. "Good. Now we wait 2 days." Marcus set the phone down and looked out at the lake. 2 days was nothing. He had been waiting for months. He had learned, in those months, that patience was not passive. Patience was a form of pressure. Quiet, invisible, building against the surface until the surface could no longer hold. The dock was down. The water was next. The fountains went dry on a Tuesday. Nobody noticed at first. The decorative basin near the lakeside ridge entrance, the one with the copper heron sculpture that Patricia Voss had personally selected from a catalogue 2 years ago, the one that appeared in every piece of HOA marketing material ever printed, simply stopped. The water that had cycled through it for 15 years fell to a trickle, then to a dark wet ring around the basin's edge, and then to nothing. The copper heron stood in silence over an empty bowl, its beak pointed at water that was no longer there. By Wednesday morning, the irrigation heads along the community's main boulevard had begun to sputter. Lawns that had been kept to a precise 2-inch height by the HOA's contracted landscaping crew started to show the first pale edges of stress. The grass didn't die immediately. It just began to look tired, thirsty, like something that had been promised a thing it was no longer going to receive. Marcus Chen watched from his kitchen window with a cup of coffee and said nothing. He had submitted the formal notice 4 days earlier. Susan Waverley had drafted it with the same surgical precision she brought to every document in this case. 3 paragraphs, no excess language, no emotional content. It stated simply that pending the resolution of active legal disputes between Marcus Chen and the Lakeside Ridge Homeowners Association, all informal access arrangements to the waterway corridor bisecting Mr. Chen's property were hereby suspended. The HOA was reminded that no formal easement granting community access had ever been executed. The developer's original conservation easement granted access rights to the county for environmental maintenance purposes only. It granted nothing to the HOA. It granted nothing to David Rothstein. It had, for 15 years, simply been assumed, the way powerful people assume things that have never been challenged. The assumption was over. Rothstein called Waverley's office 3 times on Thursday. She returned none of the calls personally. Her paralegal responded by email each time, redirecting the HOA to communicate through formal legal channels and attaching for reference the 47-page complaint already filed with the state's HOA regulatory board. On Friday, the county fire marshal arrived at Lakeside Ridge. His name was Deputy Marshal Terence Okafor, and he had received a complaint, anonymous, though Marcus knew it had come from one of the 7 homeowners who had quietly contacted Waverley's office over the previous 3 weeks, people who had their own histories with the board, their own unpaid fines, their own stories of letters ignored and appeals dismissed. Okafor walked the community's perimeter with a clipboard and a calm professional expression that communicated nothing. And what he found was this. The emergency fire suppression infrastructure that served 42 homes in Lakeside Ridge depended on a gravity-fed water draw from the retention system. That retention system drew from the waterway. The waterway ran through Marcus Chen's property, and the access point that maintenance crews had used for 15 years to service the intake valves was no longer available. Okafor issued a formal deficiency citation to the HOA that same afternoon. He gave them 30 days to demonstrate a compliant fire suppression solution or face escalating county action. He was polite about it. He was thorough. He left a copy with the HOA's property manager and drove away without drama. The board called an emergency meeting that night. Marcus wasn't there, of course. He wasn't a member of the board. He wasn't a member of anything they controlled. But Waverley had a contact, a homeowner named Greta Solano, who had attended every board meeting for 2 years, with a notepad and a quiet fury about a fence violation that had cost her $4,000. And Greta sent a text at 9:47 that evening that read simply, "Rothstein looks like a man who finally understands what he did." What Rothstein had done, stripped to its architecture, was this. He had built a community governance structure on the assumption that property owners would not fight back. He had installed Patricia Voss as compliance director because she was thorough and humorless and would enforce the bylaws with the consistency of a machine, and a machine doesn't need to be right. It only needs to keep moving. He had looked at Marcus Chen, quiet, methodical, a retired engineer who spent 3 years caring for his mother instead of fighting about a dock, and he had calculated that Marcus was the kind of man who absorbs things, who pays, who eventually goes away. He had been wrong about every part of that. The lawsuit was now a matter of public record. The state complaint had been picked up by a regional property rights organization that published a summary on their website, and that summary had been shared 400 times in 48 hours by people who had their own HOA stories, their own copper herons, their own $50,000 fines for structures that predated the authority trying to erase them. Marcus had not spoken to any media. He had not posted anything. He had simply allowed the documents to exist in the world, and the world had done the rest. On Saturday, them 3 homeowners resigned from the HOA's Architectural Review Committee. On Sunday, the HOA's insurance carrier sent a letter, formal, measured, devastating, informing the board that coverage for the pending legal action would be contingent on a full internal review of the fine issuance process, and that the carrier had significant concerns about the enforceability of the fines in question. The letter used the phrase potential bad faith conduct once, in the 3rd paragraph, and did not need to use it again. Patricia Voss submitted her resignation Monday morning. She sent it by email, no explanation, no forwarding address. Her office in the community center was cleared by noon. The filing cabinet where she had kept her violation notices, color-coded, alphabetized, maintained with the devotion of someone who had confused order for justice, was left behind, unlocked, its contents available to anyone who wanted to look. Waverley called Marcus at 2 in the afternoon. The HOA's attorney had made contact. Not Rothstein personally. Rothstein was apparently no longer speaking directly to anyone, but the attorney, a man named Garfield, who had the voice of someone who had recently been made to understand the full dimensions of a problem he thought was simple. Garfield wanted to discuss resolution, full resolution, the fines, the lawsuit, the state complaint, the fire suppression situation, all of it. He had used the word comprehensive 4 times in a 3-minute conversation, which Waverley said was the legal equivalent of a white flag. Marcus asked her what she thought. She said she thought they should let Garfield wait until Wednesday. Let the irrigation system stay dry for 2 more days. Let the fire marshal's citation sit on the board's table for another 48 hours. Not out of cruelty. She was careful to say that, but because the terms of any resolution needed to reflect the full weight of what had been done. $50,000 in unenforceable fines, 3 years of ignored letters, a board that had looked at a man's legal documentation and decided in writing that he was unlikely to hire a lawyer. Marcus said that sounded right to him. He walked out to the edge of his property after the call, to the place where the waterway ran quiet and steady through the corridor of his land, doing what water does. Moving, indifferent to the politics of the people who had built their assumptions around it. The retention system downstream was still. The intake valves sat dry. 42 homes waited on the other side of a dispute that had started with a dock and a zealot and a chairman who had confused leverage with authority. The water was still his. It had always been his. He stood there for a long time, listening to it move,